Hi everyone, I'm Geoff Hall. We're here once again at the Westford Museum. And just a little background, the Historical Society has been around since around 1958, and a lot of people's names could be synonymous with the Historical Society. I think of today Bob Oliphant, Penny LaCroix and Dan LaCroix, Marilyn Day, all of these names synonymous with the work that's been done over the years. My guest today is Ken Tebbetts, and some people would say his name was synonymous with bringing the Historical Society into the 21st century. And we'll get into that, Ken, as we speak. Ken grew up in Westford. He attended the Westford schools, graduated from Nashoba Tech in 1974, and said, "I'm leaving Westford and I'm never going to return." And he has several times.
True.
So Ken, first of all, I want to get into your family background. You're from quite a very prominent family. Tell us a little bit about when they first came to town.
Sure. So my last name is Tebbetts, as you know, and that side of my family, my father came in 1947. He had just gotten out of the war. There was the GI Bill at the time, and he grew up in Somerville, so he was more of an urban city person, but he wanted to farm. He had a passion for farming.
Before we get into that, though, Ken,
yes.
I want to kind of focus on your mom's side of the family.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
Because the Sullivans,
yes,
and they were originally the O'Sullivans, am I correct?
Yes, let's talk about the Sullivans. So the Sullivans came to Westford in 1897. So, and it was Timothy and Margaret Sullivan, who are my great-grandparents, my mother's grandparents. And they came in 1897, and here to Westford Center. They came to farm here. And
where'd they settle initially?
Initially, I'm not exactly sure, but I believe one of the places they had was on Wright Lane, down off of Hildreth Street on Wright Lane.
Where the salt box?
Yeah, the salt box house. My mother was actually born in that salt box house.
Interesting.
Yes.
Okay.
And they, so Tim and Margaret, they're both Sullivans from Ireland, from County Cork in Ireland. I know a lot more about Margaret's history than I do about Tim's. I'm still working on Tim, so I'm not exactly sure where he's from.
You actually made a trip to Ireland.
I did make a trip to Ireland in 2019. Soon after I retired, I went with all my documents about what I knew about Timothy and Margaret, and I met with a genealogist at the archives there. And that genealogist really put Margaret's story together for me. And during that trip, I was with my sister Linda, and we were able to actually go to my great-grandmother's homeland, which is in Cork, the west part of Cork, in a town called Castletownbere. And her village was West Derrymahin, and we actually got to walk through that village. I didn't find her house, but I got to walk through that village.
Didn't you tell me at one time that as you were walking through and seeing these people, the ones closer to the family, that you could actually see the family resemblance?
Yeah, no question. It was very interesting that, you know, walking the streets of Castletownbere, the village, our family names, which happens to be, of course, be Sullivan and O'Sullivan. Margaret was an O'Sullivan, Tim was a Sullivan, but there's a lot of story behind that I'm not going to get into now. But anyway, so Margaret did drop the O when she came to this country in the middle 1880s.
She was a very interesting individual.
Yes.
Let's get back here to the United States.
Yes.
And here we are. Here's this Margaret Sullivan, a very business-minded woman, okay?
Yeah.
Very bright,
That's
settling in, I'm going to say these Irish Catholics, settling in the center of Westford with these Brahmin Protestants.
Right. So some challenges there. Of course, the time she came, the 1880s, that was really during the height of the migration from Europe to the United States. Lots of Irish, lots of Italians, lots of different people, and a lot of pushback against that immigration movement. And I believe one of the things, so in our family, it's just really surprising to me that we really don't know a lot there's not a lot of family lore about what was in Ireland, who was in Ireland, and all of that. There's not very much conversation, so I really had to dig to learn about it. And I think the reason for that is when you immigrated during, I'm going to say from about 1880 to about 1920, you needed to assimilate to the ways of this country. Yeah. And Margaret is a good example of that. She really, there wasn't any minimal conversations about home, her home, which was Castletown Bear. And life was here, and they farmed. And she had a real passion for real estate. She liked to buy houses, and she did. And in 1927, she was the main story in the Lowell paper. In a Lowell paper, it says Westford woman buys Hildreth estate on a bid of $12,000. That was the headline of a Lowell paper.
Oh, so you know the Hildreth's estate
yes.
is the one down off of Hildreth Street that later on became the hospital during the late 1930s, yes.
Yes.
And so if you're wondering what the building is, it's at the top of the hill just when you get down Hildreth Street. Okay.
It's 10 Hildreth Street. It's owned by the Eccles today.
Yeah, but she bought property prior to that,
she bought 44 Boston Road. She bought 57 Main Street, which is still in our family. My cousin Kevin Sullivan is the fourth generation to own that. Margaret bought it. She bought it as a renter, to rent it out. Somebody you might have known, but Leo Larkin, who was a janitor in the Westford Academy.
He was my janitor when I was at Westford Academy.
He rented that for a number of years.
And then Sonny and Monica moved into it, correct?
My Uncle Sonny, my Uncle Sonny, and Monica, my grandfather, Margaret died in 1936, and then my grandfather inherited, John Sullivan was my grandfather, and he inherited it, and then he sold it to Sonny and Monica, and now, today, Kevin owns it.
For people wondering where this house is, if you're staying at Town Hall, it's the one right beside it,
right
on the left-hand side.
Hall. That's right.
Yeah. Okay.
That's right.
So she bought that, she bought
44.
44, okay, right. Boston Road.
Yes.
Does that end up with the Sullivans, with Joe Sullivan, your uncle?
No, actually, that's Ed Sullivan.
Okay.
So Ed Sullivan, she bought the house on 44 Boston Road in 1903, then sold it sometime later, about I'm not exactly sure of the year, 1915, I think, and then she bought it again for Ed. And his wife Millie, it was 1930, in the 1930s.
And Ed ends up here in the center of town, doesn't he?
Then Ed sold that and bought the house where the police station sits today. It was the Osgood's house. And there was a barn that sat there right in front of the cannon. If you're standing at the cannon and you look straight ahead, toward the town hall buildings, there was a barn right there that Ed used to store some
of his school buses.
School buses, yeah. School bus number 10 was the first one there.
Yeah. Okay. So she buys up all of this property at the time. What I'm thinking is, women don't get the right to vote till 1920. Right. All right. And here's this woman coming in with a business mind, buying real estate, and all within the center of town, okay? Most immigrants at the time were in the villages working in the mills. That's what kind of fascinated me about it. So she's quite a woman. She established the Sullivan family here in the center of town. Is that safe to say?
Oh, yes, yes, for sure, yes.
Okay, another very prominent is your grandfather. Okay?
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about who he was and what he did in the town?
Yes. So I'll just say that Margaret had, she had 5 children. The oldest daughter was Catherine. She died of consumption in 1916. Then,
Fairly common, Ken, huh?
yes. Then Margaret, who was a school teacher, she also died of consumption when she was in her 30s. And then she had a son. The youngest son was George T. Sullivan, and he died in 1921 when he was 20 of consumption as well. So she lost 3. So that left, the oldest son was Michael Joseph, Michael Joseph Sullivan was the oldest son. And then my grandfather was born in 1899, and he became, in the 1920s, the chief of police of Westford.
Yeah.
So he was very well known and very well respected at he was the chief of police from the late 1920s until 1962 when he retired. And he lived at 11 Boston Road.
And where was the police station?
The police station was at 11 Boston Road. So my grandmother and my mothers and my aunts and uncles used to, you'd call the police station, and one of them could be on the other end of the line answering the phone.
Interesting. I mean, when you think, and he had, his deputy chief was, at the time, John Connell?
John Connell, yes, yes. And they were a team for the better part of 30 years.
Yeah. And it's amazing that the 30s, the 40s, the 50s,
yes,
and into the 1960s, when we're seeing the growth in the population.
Right.
I mean, when I grew up, 50s and the 60s is just after your grandfather had retired, and we get to see special police officers at that time.
Right.
But it just major changes.
Yes.
Yeah. I guess all of the towns around here probably would have been similar to that, though. Okay. So John Sullivan, chief of police, okay. Any stories that you have?
Yes, there are a lot of stories about John Sullivan. My grandfather, and I did know him. I was 7 when he died in 1963, and he was a character. He was born with a hair lip and a cleft palate, so he had a speech impediment. And in those days, they did not repair hair lip or a cleft palate, and one of sort of the stories about him is he was an incredible fighter. You didn't want to get into a physical altercation with my grandfather. He had big fists, and he had just he would go into a bar room and calm things down because you didn't want to get into a row with him. And those that did regretted their time. The other thing about him is he loved to garden. He had a garden which today sits where Robert Walker's house sits. So that big house that's new on Hildreth Street, that was my grandfather's garden, literally. When I was a young kid, that's where he gardened, and in that back area. And he used to be very generous to people. He would bring fruits and vegetables if a family was in need of something at the time, and he knew it. I heard those stories from people later on.
So more than just the chief of police, he knew who the families were that were the needy families, and simply by word of mouth, these people were taken care of because of his contact with the community.
Yeah. The other thing that I heard stories about was how he treated teenagers that were in trouble. He had this philosophy that a teenager should not go into the court system, that those problems should be handled at home. So, as I understand it, what he would do is one of the big something that happened with some frequency in Westford Center was people would like to roll the cannons down the street. So there's some discipline that would need to happen, and the cannonballs would be going down the street, and he would, he would put a kid in the police car and go to their parents' house and have a conversation around dinner time about how do we want to handle this, what do we want to do. That's a more minor infraction, I guess, at the time. But anyway, he had a reputation for treating teenagers respectfully, I would say, and keeping them as if he could keep them out of the court system.
You know, it sounds, and I saw this carrying over into the 60s when I was growing up. There was the old saying, you know, if the police caught you and kicked your butt, you didn't go home and tell your parents because you got it again.
Right.
Okay? And that's the kind of thing that you saw with the police departments and those who worked under John Sullivan. Some of those special police officers kept that philosophy going. I don't know how it's done today, but there was that small town kind of a way of dealing with those sorts of problems, Ken. Yeah.
Right. The thing that surprised, the thing that I learned about him, the startling thing for me anyway, in 1980 I was at a wake of a family person, more distantly related, and it was 1980. He died in 1963, and people were talking about him as if he were there, as if he had just, and I was really like, what? And they were just telling story after story about my grandfather, and I was quite surprised. And then when I came back to Westford and I was affiliated with the Historical Societies, again I heard a lot of people talk about him very thankfully and warmly. So yeah, he was an interesting character, and I was grateful to have known him. He would always pinch my knee, all of us, he'd squeeze our knee, and he liked to take us in the police car for a little ride, which for me was terrifying. For my brother Dan, who you know well, is like, wow. So anyway.
Okay, Ken, so that's John. His daughter is Margaret.
Yeah.
Okay, named after?
So interesting. I don't exactly know who she's named after, but there are naming conventions in the Irish, in Ireland. So Michael Joseph is named after Timothy's father. So through my research, I know that Timothy's father's name was Michael, and interestingly enough, he named his oldest son Michael Joseph. Joe went by Joe, but Uncle Joe is Uncle Joe, but his first name was Michael after Timothy's father. Yeah. So my mother's name, if you followed that convention, should be Mary, which is her mother's name. Mary Cosgrove was her name. But that's not what happened. But just before my mother's born in July of 27, just before she was born, her Aunt Margaret died of consumption. I mentioned Margaret earlier. So Margaret died in the spring of 1927. And so I believe, I do not know factually, but I believe my mother was named after her aunt, not her grandmother. But who knows? I don't know that. Only John.
You know, it's interesting, Ken. We just finished I just finished a couple of Westford Tales with two people, Mickey Crocker, class of 46.
Yes.
Shirley McDougall, class of 46.
Yes.
And they both mentioned Margaret Sullivan,
right.
class of 46.
Yes.
Quite a class. So.
Yes.
A little bit about your mother. How does she, she goes to Cameron School, graduates from Westford Academy in 46.
Right, she went to Frost School.
Frost School, excuse me.
Frost School. Yeah, she went to Frost School and with Shirley and Mickey. And then she went to Westford Academy and she graduated from Westford Academy and was very proud of that. And she was affiliated from day one, from the time she graduated until the time she died. She was affiliated with the Westford Academy Alumni Association. At various times she would be like the treasurer, she'd hold some roles. She was there when I became a member and was president, yes. And they have a scholarship named after her. Yes, they do. I'm very grateful for that. She she her first job out of high school was at the post office, right, which was right next to this house on Lincoln Street.
Okay.
So there's
Yep.
Ed Conley's place, the yellow place, and there's the White House, which I think is 4 Lincoln Street, where Ellen Hardy and Mike Hardy used to live. And then right next to it was a little one-room
Yes.
post office. That's where my mother worked. That was her first job. And then when she got married to my father, she stopped working.
Did she meet your father through the post office?
Yes, she did meet him she had a lot of contact with him through the post office. So my father came, as I said at the beginning, in 1947, 48 time frame, and she met him there as well as at Kimball's. So my father worked at Kimball's as well.
Oh, okay.
And so between the two places, between the post office, their romance really started at the post office and at Kimball's. Both places is where they got to know each other.
Okay, so your dad, he is in the Air Force, you said?
No, he was in the Navy.
In the Navy, okay.
Yeah.
And
Went to
the war's over. He ends up here in Westford. Decides he wants to be a farmer. Uses the GI Bill of Rights. And I mentioned the fact that he was a veteran of World War II because it's going to have an effect later on in this story.
Yeah.
But he marries your mother, and they move where?
So what happens is he wants to be a farmer, and he grew up in the city. He grew up in Somerville. And he takes the farm on, and the farm on Littleton Road, it actually sat where what used to be Bradley's Sports Shop on 110, just
Sure.
up from the old Oak and
Yeah.
Bucket, is the first property he bought in Westford. And he bought it with his twin sister. They each got money from the GI Bill to do the initial payment for that property. It had a huge cattle barn. It had a big barn. And the entire family, my father's parents, his sister, another friend, all lived in that house. And when my father and mother married, she moved into the house.
Okay.
And then my sister Brenda was born in 1950. She went into the house too. So the house had a lot of people.
This is the old McDonald's farm.
This is the old McDonald farm that he had. But his farming skills were not strong, and the winters were really tough in those few years. And water was freezing, and just managing Holsteins was really got to be difficult. And so in 1952, he sold it, the farm on Littleton Road. I would argue quite heartbroken that was a dream that sort of failed, and it didn't work out for him.
Let me stop you there, Kenny, but looking back at my notes and previous conversations, the Dunboy Farm?
Dunboy Farm. Dunboy Farm. That's so about 3 years ago, I was talking to my Aunt Helen Hennessy, who lives in Chelmsford, and she told me that at 10 Hildreth Street, where Margaret bought the house, and then my grandfather and Uncle Joe both inherited that property.
Okay.
And that's when it got rented to be a hospital. In the time that before they sold it, they rented it out, and it became a hospital.
Okay.
But the barn, when from 1927 until 1942, when Margaret died in 1936, Timothy died in 1942, the barn had a sign on it that said Dunboy Farm.
Okay.
And Dunboy, Aunt Helen picked this up, was that, my Aunt Helen, Dunboy is a castle on the Barrow Island of Ireland that has ancient ties to protecting that area from the Vikings and alike. And so there is a place called the Dunboy Castle just off on the Barrow Island, just off of West Cork, that has that name.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Oh, okay.
That's where that comes
I know
from.
the farm fit in there someplace,
Yeah.
and I'm saying,
Yeah.
so farming had been kind of a thing on the Sullivan side
Yes.
of the family, but your dad comes up from Somerville, right?
Yes.
Experiments, decides, this just isn't working out, okay? So he moves from there, okay, to Graniteville.
Yes.
Okay.
My mother and father moved to Graniteville, and it was they rented the house that was adjacent to the, and it still exists today. It's adjacent to what was the Graniteville Nursing Home. Today is Chet and Nancy Cook's house.
Yes.
And the Gladoos used to own the
Spent
rent.
some time there, Mike.
Yeah.
Yes, the Gladys who ran for Hutchings at the time, and there was a barn in front that burnt in 1956.
Yes.
And that house, they were there for a couple of years,
Yeah,
Kenny?
a couple of years. Yes,
That's where you were born,
That's
right?
where I came home. I was born in Lowell General Hospital, but I came home to, on North
Yeah.
Street, that house, yes.
And then from there, from North Main Street, you mean?
North Main Street
North
is what
Main
I
Street,
mean.
North
That's
Street,
right.
so there-
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so your father and your mother buy the house on West Street then?
Yeah,
from there.
1956. By 1956, that's right. They buy that house in 1956 at on West Street.
Yeah.
Yes, and that's where I grew up, and we had that house until 1982.
Interesting, interesting couple. And I knew your dad and mom both. I knew your mom an awful lot better. But your father, not getting into a lot of politics, but your father was a Republican and your mother was a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat, right?
That is very true. So at our dinner table, there were, yes, my father was what I call an Eisenhower Republican, and all of the Tebbettses were Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
And the Sullivans, my mother was a very active, what I called a Kennedy Democrat.
Mm-hmm.
And
Okay.
she worked, for politicians. She would be on the phone calling people and campaigning for people. Both of them at one point were one was on the Democratic committee here in Westford, the other was on the Republican committee.
Mm-hmm.
And when they would get in the car, this was very funny, they would get in the car on election day and they would laugh because they were going to cancel each other out. Those votes were not going to mean a whole lot. And they would laugh. And we had a lot of rich political discussions at the table. I'll tell you something, Geoff, about my parents. Well, the one thing that I know definitively about them, so they were interesting characters. They were characters, some little bit of crazy there as well, but they truly loved each other. And it's really interesting that to me that they were so, in their politics they were so polar, in their religion they were so polar. My mother was very Catholic, my father was Protestant, as was his family, but yet they had a deep respect and love for each other. That you don't see all. In my lifetime, I've seen true love, but my parents had it, and I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, and you were fortunate.
Fortunate, yes.
Because knowing your brothers and sisters, it reflects within the entire family. We talked one time about, okay, so who had, with you and Danny anyways, I know that you kind of had your mother's influence in your politics.
Well, that's a really interesting, because for me, I was a little more political myself.
Yes.
It was always, I always sided with whoever I was in favor with. So if I was upset with my mother for some whatever, then I would support my father's, whatever my father was supporting. I would be, okay, I'm going with this. Where it played interesting was when Nixon was being elected, and in 1968, those were really tumultuous times in this country, and I for some reason, I'm not exactly sure why,
I want
but
you
yeah,
to hold
please.
that
Yeah,
right there,
absolutely.
Ken,
I'll hold
because
that.
I want to get into that a little bit.
Sure, absolutely.
But I want to talk, we talked earlier about, you growing up, and you used the term mentors several times.
Yeah.
So we're going to proceed through your history,
Yes.
starting at Cameron School, and
Sergeant School.
right up through the end of high school, okay?
Yep.
In 1974. And talk about the people who had influences on you.
Sure, okay.
Gene Bell.
Gene Bell. So I went to sergeant school, like
Yeah.
you, sergeant school. And the year was 1961. Interesting time because the Bay of Pigs was happening, let's say, at the national level. What we were doing was we were going under these bomb shelters. You're going in, boop, and you go underground, and so to protect in case there's a nuclear explosion or an atomic bomb goes off. What that did to me, it's like, in my head, it made me a little fearful. Like, could this really happen? And because I was first grade, second grade, and we're doing these drills. And at home, we had, in the basement, we had tuna fish and we had water, and you could, kind of vision living in the basement of the house, in the cellar, in case a bomb goes off. So I became a little bit I was nervous anyway, and it made me a little bit nervous. But anyway, sergeant school, I had great group of teachers that I remember each of them well. But Jean Bell was my second grade teacher, and she had a funny way of keeping your attention. She would come over to your desk and she'd just put her finger on the top of your head to remind you, like,
I remember her well.
wake up. And she's the person who helped me most with my penmanship, which actually stopped when I finished second grade. My penmanship is about at a second grade.
But you had some a reading a disability.
Yes,
dyslexic?
I did. Slightly dyslexic. Yes, I am. As was my father, pretty seriously dyslexic. But anyway, so sergeant school was a great run. To this day, today, I get together maybe 3 or 4 times a year with some people from that time period.
Okay.
Elaine St. Gelais, Darlene Dundas puts the
God,
meetings
Elaine's
together.
my cousin.
Yes. Joyce Kulikowski. So we get together and have dinner at least 3 or 4 times a year, which it's lovely. So, but there's sergeant school.
Irene Mitchell?
Irene Mitchell. So that's Westford Academy. So I got to Westford Academy, and Irene Mitchell was the head of the student council. I was on student council. I loved it. I was for student rights.
Once again, that political background.
So student rights all the way, and there was a lot of conversation at that time. Another thing that was interesting was smoking. Students wanted to be able to smoke at high school. What would happen is kids would go into the restroom and they would get caught and then get a detention. And so there was this theory that let's reduce that and have students smoke outside, allow students to smoke outside. I was all for it. I was I was pro-smoking outside. Although I never smoked myself, I was like, okay, well, this will solve that problem.
It's a rights thing, yeah.
Yeah, right.
That's that turbulent period you began to talk about, the late 60s, the early 70s.
Yes.
You had the civil rights movement, you had Vietnam.
Yes.
Okay.
So Vietnam was interesting because also another thing that really unnerved me. So I felt like I did not want to go to Vietnam, and we had the draft, and people from our village, Graniteville, Westford, were being drafted and going and coming back.
And some not.
And some not. And the person that I knew was Charlie Aaron, was somebody who was, of course, much older than I was, 5 or 6 years older than I was.
Not much older, because he was my age.
Right. But he was just somebody who was around, and he had a nice car, a sports car, I thought, and he was an interesting guy, and I just saw him from a distance. I didn't know him. I saw him from a distance in the village. You knew who he was, with his red hair, and he was just a good person, and he didn't come back, and to his family, and it scared me.
So you're torn here.
I'm torn. I don't want to go to Vietnam. I'm determined. I spent a lot of time at the J.V. Fletcher Library studying about Canada. I knew a lot about Canada, and I knew a lot about Australia, because I thought that I would be a pacifist and I would leave. But
I was going to say, Ken, so here's this guy who's a pacifist, basically. And this is a struggle a lot of people your age or my age were having at the time. How do you resolve that with your father, who's a World War II veteran?
Well, that was tough. It wasn't going to be resolved with my father. My father was adamant that if my number came up, that I was going. There was a little discussion, and I would shake. I would actually physically shake at the dinner table when the topic would come up. Because at that time, unlike today, like the war we've just been through for 20 years, that was on the 6 o'clock news every single night, vividly. You saw people coming back maimed, you saw people coming back dead, you saw people coming back, and you saw some of the action of the war itself. I just couldn't picture myself in it. It was like very frightening to me.
And there was always the question, what are we doing there?
There was the question of what are the politics of it, which created an environment at school for me, particularly at Westford Academy and at the Tech, of not wanting to talk about my position because it was too scary. People were really, there were people like my father who fought in World War II who really believed you need to show up and do the service, and then there were other people who said we shouldn't be there, this is the wrong thing to be doing, and it was a real conflict. So I just kind of did my level best to keep quiet and my head down and create my own plan if I got called. What happened is I graduated in 1974, the war came to
Tech, right?
That's right,
you
from
left
Neshoba.
and you went. Was anyone there particularly that had a huge influence on you?
Everybody had a little influence, but nobody that I recall. But on the mentor front, I want to talk about Jack Kimball, who was in this playing in the part at the same time. So I worked in my sophomore and junior year of high school for Kimball's Ice Cream, and I made ice cream. And Jack Kimball had a significant influence on me. He was a steady hand. He taught me the thing to this day that has stuck with me is Jack would always say, Kenny, you gotta have a system. You gotta have a system. I'm a bit chaotic sometimes about how I approach things, and he would say, you've gotta have a system for things. And things need to go 1, 2, 3, 4 like that. And that's how ice cream was made at Kimball's. You do step 1, he had the recipes printed out. Step 1, you took the can, and it was all mapped out. And that's how Jack worked. And I will never forget both Jack and Clara Kimball, their kindness and generosity to me. They were very, very good to me. And I loved working there. I met a lot of people working there.
And you hear that from all of those from that generation, that, that my sister-in-law worked there. And it's the same thing. You go back time and time again in ways they helped you. I mean, to move along, but quickly, Ken, so you leave. It's 1974, you said, I'm getting out of town, I'm never coming back.
That's right. So it was 19...
And you go to Cape Cod, right?
That's right. It was 19... I wanted to go to college. I had not done really well academically. I struggled a bit. I did but I wanted to go to college, so my options were limited. I needed to pay for it myself was one criteria, and the second was I needed to stay. Because of that, I needed to stay within the state of Massachusetts, and because of the remedial work I needed to do, I needed to go to a community college. So all those things were at play. But as you know, in our generation, in 1974, the big aim, the really big aim, was to get as far away from my parents as I possibly could, from home. Let's get as far away as we possibly can, and that was important to me. Yep. So my choices became community college in Greenfield, Massachusetts, or Cape Cod. I'd never been to Cape Cod, so I selected Cape Cod, and that's where I went to community college.
And you took up kind of human resources, right? It
was more management at the time. There wasn't a human resources perspective. I spent my working career in human resources, but on Cape Cod Community College, I really had an incredibly rich experience because my advisor was a guy named Carlton Nickerson, who for the prior 10 years to 1974 had actually built Cape Cod. He actually built the facility in Barnstable, and he was a railroad executive before that, but he was brilliant. And he really helped me with economics and management and the sort of the fundamentals. And he was just a great guy. I was very fortunate to have him for 2 years because what he had done is retired and then went into teaching. So I was very lucky.
So he had an influence, and so you get into human resources, you go to work for Sears in Peabody, and you're going along in life, but you come back to Westford ultimately back in the 90s, correct?
Correct. So what happened is so in November of 1994 is election day, politics once again. And I was living in Cambridge. I was working at Cabot Corporation in Billerica, Massachusetts in human resources. And I had a rent control apartment in Cambridge that I was very fortunate to have. And that day, on November 4th, the Massachusetts voters went to the poll and voted rent control out. So I no longer had, as of January 1, a rent control apartment. And I was really stunned by that and wasn't sure what I was going to do. But I decided that at the same time, my mother's health began to deteriorate. And I decided that I would look at Westford. I would look at coming back, and I did. And I bought a house on 8 Moore Road, which was owned by Barry Crocker, which was actually constructed by the Burnham family. Virginia Burnham and her husband David actually constructed it, and their son and David's parents. David Burnham's parents.
You talked about what a great neighborhood that was.
Oh, Moore Road, that neighborhood, Leona Barad and Joni and Paul Kelly and Paul Barad and Virginia Burnham and her entire family, I've never been able to replicate that neighborhood again. And I've lived a number of places, but that particular street, West Street was great for a childhood, but the Moore Road as an adult was quite extraordinary.
It's home when you get great neighbors like that, Ken.
It really is nice.
Yeah. Okay, so you arrive, you're back here, you're on Moore Road, and all of a sudden you get involved. You're talking about, first of all, you said you talked about running for selectman.
Yeah.
Okay, that kind of fell by the wayside, but you got involved with this. How?
So the story there is that in 1995, when I moved here to Westford, I thought I was 40. I turned 40 that year, and I thought I was just going to die. I thought there is nothing for me in Westford. This is a nightmare. I felt like I wanted to help my mother, and I wanted to be close by. It was going to be easier for me. I was working in Billerica, okay, but what was I going to do here? And it came to me that I did want to run for selectman. I could be a selectman. That would get me engaged in the town. I'll do that. And of course, within a month, I realized when I left Westford in 1974, it was very different. It was 10,000 people, and today we're at 1995, we're at 19,000 people. It's a different place, and I needed to reacclimate. And I was talking to Wendy Zawicka, who's somebody that I grew up with, Wayne and Wendy Zawicka over on Wing Road. And Wendy said, get on the master plan committee, get on the master plan committee. Leslie Thomas was chair at the time. And I did. I got appointed to them. It was 1996. I got appointed to the master plan committee. And I started going to meetings. And soon after that, in April of 96, Bernie's school picking died. And when she had a seat on the historical commission, I decided that I would apply for that, and I got the seat.
Yeah. And that brought you here. So talk a little bit about that, okay, Ken? So one of the things you had said was that the historical commission, okay, in the town was working on getting Westford designated historically. Could you give a little bit about?
Sure. So when I started with the historical commission, we had an effort. It was begun in 1975 to get the town listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And 1975, we're talking 20 years we've been working on this project. Mm-hmm. That was a little boggling to me, like, wait a minute, we've got to figure this out, let's get something done here. And so we sort of chunked it out. So a lot of work had been done, but what I did was try to figure out the communities and properties that did get listed on the national, what did they do? Well, how did that happen? So I studied that for a little bit. I talked to Dick and Alan Emmett, whose home on Concord Road was on the National Register, how they did it. And then I talked to other communities, and I learned the process from the state perspective. And one of the key elements of that was having a consultant who really knew how to document and write the story.
Sanford Johnson, right?
Sanford Johnson. We hired Sanford Johnson, who was just starting out in the field at that time, and he was tremendous. And he did the work of getting, so we took about a year, just a year and a half, to get Westford Center completed. And then we went to Graniteville, Forge Village, then Brookside, and then we did the Parkerville, yep. And then the cemeteries. Mm-hmm.
And so during this process, okay, you're in the Historical Commission, you start working in the building, the cottage, which we know is the cottage where the Historical Society is located, the offices, and I remember you kind of stumbled upon, geez, there's a lot of great stuff here, but it needs to be pulled together.
Yeah. So back to Jack Kimball.
Okay.
So in my head is Jack Kimball. You got to have a system, and when there were some great activities had happened and continued to happen with the Westford Historical Society, which is different than the Historical Commission, but the story, what we really had for artifacts and what the stories were behind those artifacts was just a bit chaotic. It needed to be automated, it needed to be updated, put on it in a database, which had not been done. Everything was handwritten records at the time. And so there we ensued, that was the first order of business, was to learn what we had and how to store it and where to store it. So the cottage needed an upgrade, just it needed to be cleaned up, and the upstairs rooms we needed to build storage cabinets. You used to live here, so you used to know, so it needed a real refresh. So we got that done. You talked about, I guess the phrase you used was raising the bar to put Westford on the map. So what I learned is very quickly, I felt that and I guess I always knew, but Westford has a very rich history. We were incorporated in 1729. We went for our incorporation with the town of Bedford. I love when I meet somebody from Bedford. I say, oh, you were incorporated in 1729. amount of detail, but we have participated in every major historical event and followed sort of the culture of the United States all the way through. And
a reflection of American history right here in this
real
community.
reflection here. And because we're one of 33 towns that marched to Concord for the to begin the American Revolution, it's a key. So we played a real important role, and I felt like we really needed to capture those stories and document those stories.
And so you had people like Marilyn Day.
Marilyn Day, incredible,
okay?
yes.
And people like that you were able to bring in, to bring that to fruition. Your work, Ken, was recognized by the town, and in 2000 you were the Kiwanis Person of the Year, okay? Yes. But I want to move a little bit forward after that, okay? These things start coming together. You're bringing it all into the 21st century. 9/11 occurs.
9/11 happens, right. So once again, Westford's in it. I mean, we lost two people.
Yes.
We are, 35, 40 miles from Logan Airport, which was very significant in September 11th. And I felt like we needed to pause at that moment, that we all needed to pause as amateur historians and some serious historians, and pay very close attention to what was happening around us, and document and take photographs and log and hear people's stories and make sure we recorded that for time going forward. Yeah. And so we paused for about 3 months or so. A woman named Margaret Ryan, who was on the Historical Society board, put the documents together into a book. And then Linda did an exhibit this year of using some of that material for that exhibit.
Another key thing that occurred during that time was the Paris Center for the Arts.
Paris Center for the Arts was, yes. So that was at the time.
Which is owned by the Historical Society.
Right.
People don't know that.
That's right. The Paris Center for the Arts was part in the old days when my mother was growing up at 11 Boston Road, and Shirley McDougall was down the street and Mickey was in Forge Village. That church was called the Brown Church. So it was a congregational church. Then in the 50s there was a merger between the Universalist Church and that church joined, and over time that church got to be used less and less by the church across the street,
Congregational?
No, the parish, United Parish.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I'm not saying it correctly. Anyway, so that church was using it left and left. They built a fellowship hall, and so they put this church for sale. And at the time, people were asking me, because I was president of the Historical Society at that time, as well as the Historical Commission, they thought that because it was adjacent that we should buy it. And my initial reaction was, there is no way we're going to do that, because I felt like we were barely able to keep care of these two buildings and do the work of the preservation of what we had, that building would be not a great thing. However, there were more than one person, but there were a number of people. Well, one person came to me, Mary Kalis, and said, Kenny, in her very stern way, Mary is a contemporary of my mother's, and was a friend of my mother's as well over time, and so she sat with me and said, you need to do this, you need to buy this, and I'm going to help you do this. And I felt like a 15-year-old kid there. It's like, I don't have a choice in this. And so I went back to the board, and what she did is she really came with $50,000 in hand to begin the process. And she had talked to people and raised donations from people to make that first initial deposit on the church. And then we got into negotiations with the church, and then there was how are we going to pay for it, And then, which Mike Hardy was the treasurer of the Historical Society, so he worked on that. I'll
And
pause there.
Yeah, and I was going to say, his music program, along with Stephen Weber, kind of brought people into this building here.
Correct.
And really brought an awareness to what was going on. Am I correct?
Yes. So one of the things when we went with the museum was you'd talk to people and they wouldn't, have you been to the museum?
Yeah.
No, never been to the museum. So Mike was the treasurer of the Historical Society with some resistance, I would add, but he did it, volunteer, just retired. I asked him, and Jane Hinckley asked him actually to be the treasurer, and he did. And but we had to get people into the museum because not a lot of people came into the museum. And Mike created that with other people, as you say, Stephen Weber, but he created this music series. So once a month on a Friday night, we had 75, so we could legally seat 75 people in here, and there was a sellout. Month after month, a sellout. So that was interesting. That got people into the museum who then might come back and ask other questions about what our collection was about. But the music thing was, so there was a need for culture. So the idea then for the building next door, lots of discussions, would it be used as another adjacent building to the museum for storage and stuff like that, or offices or whatever. And that just didn't make sense because of the space we have. But the art idea came up, and a woman named Lisette Greaves and Emily Teller and Andy Kuzman and Mike Hardy, and there's a whole group, and I'm leaving some people out, I apologize, but they really took this thing about an art center seriously. Yeah. The Historical Society bought the building, and we had 1 year to pay it off. And we raised, and it was literally to the last day. We had for 1 year. It was a calendar year, January 1 to December 31st, and December 31st, the last installment came through.
So, Ken, just to kind of move along quickly, you got involved with the 275th committee. Why have a 275th? You said it kind of as to pull the town together. It was a great event. A lot of things were moving. We're now looking at the 300th anniversary. Ken buys a house at 59 Main Street. Yes. Okay. He's tired of the commute. So he moves back to Boston. Am I correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So what happens is, I want to mention one person, though, before I go to that, and that is Ellen Hardy, who was my mentor here. We were talking about my mentors. I mentioned Jack, and a Westford mentor was Ellen Hardy. Yep. So I would have ideas, and I would talk things through with Ellen. She was a significant mentor to me through the whole time that I was here. So I'll mention that. Then there was Rita Miller. So Rita Miller, we were building schools, so something had changed in Westford from the days when we were going to school. There was this austerity budget around building schools. North Middle School was about $1 million, and it was a lot of conversation and angst about building that school. So we didn't build a lot of schools, but then all of a sudden we got to this time closer to the 21st century, we're building schools, and we're naming those schools after the superintendents, which is fair, but a school would never be named after a woman, is how I felt. Yep. And I asked the school committee to think about if we could name one after a woman. And they appointed me to be the chairman of the school naming committee at that time, another piece of work. And so that is how we got to name the school after Rita Edwards Miller. Mm-hmm. And I went with Rita to see the school, and the look on her face and was just amazing. She met the principal of the school, but right before the dedication, 6 weeks before the dedication, she passed away. She died, which was sad. But she knew the school was being named. She saw the school, and she talked about how she her parents and her grandparents in particular worried about what would happen to her because her father died when she was young, and she was raised by her mother here in Westford, and how well she had done. She was the principal of a foster school for years, and had done really well. So that's Rita Miller. But I did buy 59 Main Street. Had it.
Oh, by the way, the school's, the street...
The street is named, right, that's a second part. So the street is named Mitchell Way, for Irene Mitchell Way. There's something called, in 1959, Irene Mitchell brought to Westford a system of reading that was speed reading, using machines. And that system. So Irene really helped me learn to read. To this day,
another mentor.
I'm using, another mentor. And Irene, you know, she really taught me. To this day, I use her methods for reading, like move it through. And so it was that. But the Mitchell, when they needed a name for the street, I proposed Irene Mitchell. So it's Rita Edwards Miller School and Irene Mitchell Way. Yeah. Two women who made significant contributions to our generation and our parents, actually, for Rita. Anyway, and the other thing about Irene is her parents' home was torn down to build Route 3. And she moved here to Westford to Myrtle Avenue, 1 Myrtle Avenue. Anyway.
No.
And then I'll just wrap up by saying that so I sold the house on 8 Moore Road, bought 59 Main Street next to my aunt and uncle's house, 57. We talked about that before. It was Rita Miller's house, and what happened is my mother passed away in March, and then I felt that I was ready for me to do something else, and I was working for WBUR in Boston. And I wanted to be closer to, but I didn't want to do the commute. And so
I understand that.
Yeah.
So, but okay, so you're retired.
I'm retired, yes. Now I retired in 2019, yes.
2019, you're in the West Coast now.
So I winter in Southern California, in what's called Coachella Valley in Palm Springs, California, yes.
But you're back in Westford.
Yes, so I decided, I had been threatening for 5 years to buy at the Summer Village, which is the former Wyman's Beach. So today, in January of 2022, I bought a cottage there, which I am, this is just a great purchase. I love it. I love the community, and it really reconnects me to Westford.
Yeah. Changes in Westford, Ken?
Lots of changes in Westford. But for the positive, I think the thing that one of the things I'm most excited about, the work Marilyn Day started with, she wrote the Westford Days book. It was a diary with a lot of genealogy in it, incredible, valuable today. Bob Oliphant has published a lot. Marilyn has published, as you well know, a number of books, the most recent, the 110 History. We've got all the documentation from the National Register. We need to continue to document what you're doing now with your Westford Tales. All of that is rich material for people that will come in the future.
And you're right. Your love of history, like my love of history, particularly the town's history. We're fortunate to have you at the time that we did, Ken, and we're glad that you're enjoying your retirement, but you're not going to leave us entirely. When you're back here in the summer, we'll have you here, and we'll have you doing things.
Absolutely.
I'm going to kind of wrap it up. Ken, thank you for coming today, and we look forward to having a few other people on this show. Thank you.